Welcome to the Department of Anthropology at the Field Museum. I'm Katie Good, Regenstein Pacific Collection intern. Here I'll show you what we've been doing to bring back the voice of Captain A.W.F. Fuller, an important British collector in the last century who helped make our Pacific collection one of the largest in the world. We have the honor of caring for nearly 50,000 objects from Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia, and Australia. In 1958, when Captain Fuller sold his personal collection of more than 6,500 artifacts to the Field Museum, our holdings from the South Pacific became one of the best collections in the world overnight. But one of the greatest treasures that Fuller gave us was nearly forgotten about and lost forever.
This is Sonoband 38. The date is April 8, 1958. We're continuing now with a series of Easter Island artifacts, largely stone implements.
That is the voice of the late Roland Force in 1958. When this recording was made, he was curator of oceanic archaeology and ethnology at the Field Museum, although he later became the director of the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. Dr. Force was visiting Captain Fuller in his home outside of London. For 6 months that year, they sat down and carefully described each of Fuller's artifacts, recording their conversations into a then state-of-the-art machine called a Walkie Record-All. Their 160 hours of commentary were recorded on plastic belts called Sonobands, which would become obsolete only a few years later. Typed transcripts of their conversations were made from these recordings by Roland Force's wife, Maryanne. The sonobands themselves were then packed away in a small cardboard box and stored in the archives of the Field Museum for more than 40 years. While the museum also kept the machines used to make these recordings, their condition made it impossible to play them. In 2003, the Field Museum enlisted the help of the Cutting Corporation in Bethesda, Maryland, to digitize these old sonoband recordings, which had become brittle, warped, and curled at the edges. Fortunately, however, most of them were still playable once the sound lab technicians at the corporation were able to get the museum's old Walkie Record-All machines up and running again. The old analog sonoband recordings were converted into a digital wave format so that they can be heard again for many generations to come. But we didn't want to stop there. Here in the anthropology department, we have combined new sound editing technology with an innovative audio cataloging system to transform the nearly forgotten Fuller and Force conversations into a digital research tool for both scholars and the public to enjoy. Born in Sussex, England in 1882, Captain Alfred Walter Francis Fuller was the second son of the Reverend Alfred Fuller, whose huge personal collection of butterflies, fossils, and scientific engravings filled the house and stimulated the young Fuller's interest in geography. When Fuller was 14, his father took him to Stephen's auction room in London to buy his first object, a club from Fiji.
Well, this was the first thing. I went into to Stephen's auction rooms, which was the mart for ethnographical things and natural history. I was introduced to this place by my father, who was a regular attendant there, not so much for ethnology, which didn't interest him much at the time, but natural history. So I knew them very well. I used to go there with him, and one day I attended this sale, ethnology, and this club was put up, and I bought it as a great treasure. I can't remember now what I paid for it. It was 6 or 7 shillings. It was a great treasure. Well, that started my sort of interest in the South Seas. And from that, another club came up, I suppose, and I bought that, and so on, until it's developed into this thing with some 4,000 specimens.
Although Fuller himself never traveled to the Pacific, he was fascinated by its cultural diversity, and he read everything he possibly could on the region. England had developed a strong presence in the Pacific through missionaries and traders, and it was from their personal collections that back in England Fuller was able to buy and build his own. Though Fuller and his rival collectors depended on Europe's presence in the Pacific to obtain artifacts, Fuller was nevertheless ashamed of what he called civilization and how it changed the Pacific. When discussing this Maori fishhook from New Zealand, Fuller lamented that it had been built with a European-style metal barb instead of a traditional Maori barb made of bone. A word of caution: Fuller uses language in the following excerpt that was typical of the Victorian era and may be offensive to modern listeners.
101, and now we're getting to a departure. We're getting to civilization, unfortunately for the Maori, which meant more or less extinction, like it has with every uncivilized race on the face of the earth. It always means the final extinction of the unfortunate race. So leaving the poor beggars to themselves in their own country, we take all their best land, all their fishing rights and everything else, and like the North American Indians, and we kill off all their bison and everything else, and they can't live, and they just take to drink and they die off. And that's what we've done all over the world. That's called civilization.
So why are these recordings worth listening to when there are much faster and easier ways of finding information about Pacific artifacts? First, the Fuller conversations give new context to our catalog records. Fuller tells us how he acquired each object, from whom, and why he thought it was worth having. But equally important, these recordings personify Fuller as a collector. They remind us that he was a human being, curious about the technologies of other cultures. Listen to how he describes this fish trap from Papua New Guinea.
Counter number 380.
It's a curious, a conical little basket. I don't know what induces the fish to put his head into it, but when he does so, long strips of a thorny shrub, and these very sharp little thorns stick out all along a fish or, a person's hand, and you can't pull it out without tearing it on these little hooks. So it's awful weapon to be caught in. They're sharper than shark's teeth are.
Dr. Joshua A. Bell of University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom is using the Fuller recordings as a research tool to study the art and cultures of people on the southern coast of New Guinea. He's working with Dr. Robert Welsh of Dartmouth College to understand the original contexts under which the objects were collected from the Papuan Gulf. Listening to our Sonoband recordings has helped them to trace the networks of collectors behind the Fuller collection and better understand how and when these objects left their homes. This helps them document the social and economic circumstances that contributed to the departure of these objects from the villages where they were created. In the discussion of one of these, a drum from Papua New Guinea, we also hear how collectors and museum curators were a lot less careful in handling artifacts back then than we are today.
This is a drum with a carved human face and two crocodiles, and the opening forming the mouth of a shark. Now this has a good snakeskin head on it.
Very good one.
Very good. The handle's in good condition, and there is white pigment rubbed into the carving, and I'd say that was one of the better drums that...
You see, it's rather scarce with these crocodiles. No doubt that's why I bought it, because I could have bought many of these drums when they came over 50 years ago, But then the British Museum had them, so I wouldn't touch them. It's only when something was peculiar like that.
Finally, the anthropology department is coming up with new ways to incorporate more recorded audio, like the sonobands, into our collection documentation. Listen to this discussion between Dr. John Terrell, Pacific Curator, and Arepata Hakiwai, Director Matauranga Maori of the Te Papa Museum in New Zealand. They're discussing the same Maori treasure box that Fuller and Force described on tape 50 years ago.
It's a very large square.
Yeah, it is, John,
It's also not finished, or is that?
No, we do have, there are many examples there where in Wakahui and Papahoa unfinished. In some cases there it's all worn, but that looks like it's probably unfinished.
Because that's not been finished. Not that that's against it.
No, no.
You see, when the native carved this, he probably died or was killed. Well, his son wouldn't go on carving it, but the son would. Sometimes the son would go on carving his father's things. But I personally, if my father had left a thing unfinished, I'd leave it as he left it. I wouldn't go and interfere with his work.
No.
And you don't get with a great painter if he's painted a picture and left some details undone. You wouldn't go and get a second-rate man to paint that in.
No.
You'd leave a picture as it was. Well, it's the same with these works of art.
Now, my understanding is that one of the things that you store in here are feathers, because feathers, if they are put in the head, then become sacred, and you don't want to touch them, and you don't want them to be on the ground. So you need to store them someplace where they're safe, and you're safe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And many of these, the wakahui were hung in the rafters and suspended, and that's why they're probably so carved and ornate underneath. So you'd have things like heru, combs, feathers, puia, amokura, you'd have heitiki, you'd have mako sharp earrings, and actually anything valuable, especially associated with the head. So it gives you an idea of the importance of that, and probably in terms of the association with the upo or the head too, that these were quite, extremely valuable and prized.
By allowing us to listen to voices from the present and the past, recorded audio like the Sonobands can be used as a valuable resource for interpreting our collections. I hope you've enjoyed listening to these sounds as much as I have.